Hello, and thank you for attending the third of AGR's series of 4 webinars on merchandise financial planning. In this one, I'll be looking at how to plan markdowns and promotions and examining the effect that they have on margins. I'm Keith Dunn, the Principal Consultant for Buying and Merchandising here at AGR. I've worked in retailing for many years, during which time I've had senior buying and merchandising roles in a wide range of international businesses, including those whose logos you can now see on screen. Before I start this webinar, just a reminder of the other sessions in the series. The first 2 webinars, Planning for Success and Take Control of Your Stock, are now available online. There's one more still to run, and in the final session I'll be looking at how to balance the costs and benefits of online returns. Go to our website at agrdynamics.com for the dates and registration details for the upcoming sessions and to find the link to the recordings of the first 2. In this session, I'm going to look at how good planning of markdowns and promotions can help to ensure that the impact on margin is minimised, and how you can use merchandise financial planning to achieve this. We'll look at why you need markdowns, what drives the level of markdown you need to plan, and why clever markdown planning can help you to deliver more margin. We'll then look at promotions and how they affect the margin, and at why the minimum uplift in sales units that you need to achieve often means that they don't deliver the expected result. Apologies in advance, but this session does involve some maths, so calculators at the ready. Before we continue, can I point to the Q&A button on your Teams bar? If you have any questions while we go through this webinar, use this to ask them, and my colleagues will get back to you. Let's start with the definitions. A markdown is a permanent reduction in the selling price of a product. When you apply a markdown, both the selling value of the stock you're holding and the future margin on sales that can be achieved are reduced. The units you're holding and the cost value of the stock doesn't change. A promotional discount, on the other hand, is a short-term reduction in the price of the product applied at the point of sale. The margin is reduced only while the promotion is running. Future margins aren't affected and the stock value doesn't change. Markdowns and promotional discounts both have the same overall effect on margins. They reduce the level that you would have achieved if the product had sold at full price. There is one significant difference though. Markdowns are inevitable, while discounts are discretionary. You don't need to offer any promotional discounts, but at some point you will need to take markdowns. Let's have a look at this in a bit more detail, starting with markdowns. The reason that markdowns are inevitable is tied to the product life cycle. All products have a life cycle, which in simple terms we can represent as 3 phases. I'm going to call the first the primary phase. This groups together the growth and maturity phases of the traditional life cycle, which you might be more familiar with, and is when demand for the product at its original selling price is growing or stable. This phase can be as short as a few weeks, or as long as several years, and over that time you will want to maintain optimum stock levels. This is followed by the decline phase. At this point, demand starts to fall rapidly, because most of the customers who wanted the product and were willing to pay full price for it have already bought it. This is followed by the final phase, which I've called stagnation, where there is little or no demand for the product at any viable price. What you need to do when the product starts to decline is to reduce the price to a level that will stimulate demand enough to liquidate the remaining stock as quickly as possible, before the product does stagnate. If you don't do this, then there's a real danger that demand for the product will stagnate before you act. If that does happen, then the product is not likely to sell no matter what the price, and you could end up having a serious problem with excess unproductive stock. I hope you can see from this that markdowns are not optional and have to be taken at the appropriate time. Needless to say, the cost of this markdown needs to be fully incorporated into your financial plans, and we'll discuss what level you should set it at shortly. By the way, this principle can be applied to product categories as well as to individual products. Take the example of CRTV televisions, which I used in the last webinar, where some retailers ended up with a lot of stock they couldn't sell because they didn't react quickly enough when the category went into decline. Good markdown planning and execution might not have solved the problem entirely, but it would certainly have helped. Now that we understand the need for timely markdowns, let's look at how you decide what level of markdown you should be planning. The 2 key drivers of this are the full price sell-through, together with the average depth of markdown that you'll need to clear the stock effectively. Let's look at these in turn. Full price sell-through is the ratio of the full price sales to the buy. The ratio is the same whether you use value or units. You may already use full price sell-through for product planning and performance analysis, but what we're interested in here is the average for the category that you're planning. If you know what full price sell-through you can achieve, you can work out what your full price sales should be. If your buy is £2,000 for instance, and your full price sell-through is 60%, then you'd expect to achieve £1,200 of full price sales. As far as markdown planning is concerned, we're interested in the inverse of this calculation, which tells us the value of the stock that we'll be marking down. The inverse of 60% is 40%, and £2,000 times 40% is £800. In other words, £2,000 minus the full price sales of £1,200. If you know what the average full price sales is for your category then, and you should be able to determine what this is quite easily by analysis of past performance, you can calculate the opening value of the stock that will be marked down for any level of buy. And just to emphasise, the relationship between the stock to be marked down and the full price sell-through will not change no matter what the buy. Now that we know the value of the stock we're going to be marking down, we need to consider the second driver of markdown value, the average depth of markdown. This may not be as familiar to you, but what it tells us is how much in total we will reduce the value of this stock throughout the clearance event. To calculate it, you simply divide the total cost of markdown for the whole clearance event by the opening stock at the beginning of the event. This ratio is very important when it comes to setting the markdown plans. How much you need to spend on markdowns in the course of an event will depend on how you go about managing the reductions. When a product is reduced for clearance, the objective is to get rid of as much of the stock we have left as we can before demand stagnates. But at the same time, we want to maximise the overall margin the product will deliver. What happens, therefore, is that we don't make a single large cut in the price, but will reduce it in phases over the period of the event, with the level of each reduction depending on how well the product is performing. The rule I've always found useful here is that the first reduction should be enough to clear 50% of the markdown stock in the first 2 weeks of the event. The second should clear another 50% of the remaining stock in the next 2 weeks, and so on. In general, this can be achieved by applying an initial reduction of 30% on the original selling price, followed by 50% for the second hit, and a final reduction of 70%. You might be able to start with a 20% reduction if the line is performing well, but may need an initial reduction of 50% for a product that has performed really badly, but the same principle applies. In practice, it's a bit more dynamic than this, since you would monitor how well the price cut works in stimulating demand for each markdown, and if it doesn't work as well as expected, you wouldn't wait 2 weeks to apply another reduction. Applying this to our example product, we would expect to see something like this. We start with 40 units of stock worth £800 before markdown, and we reduce the price using the 30, 50, 70 rule. The cost of markdown for each hit is calculated by multiplying the price reduction that has been made to the opening stock units in that week, which gives us a total markdown for the event of £360. The average depth of markdown, in other words the percentage that the initial value of the stock has been reduced over the course of the event, is therefore 360 divided by 800, or 45%. You can easily determine what a normal average depth of markdown would be to achieve the required level of stock liquidation by analysing previous clearance events. Remember, if the stock levels didn't reduce quickly enough, then you probably weren't spending enough markdown. The important thing about the two measures we've just been looking at is that for a given full price sell-through and average depth of markdown, the cost of markdown as a percentage of the buy is a constant. In other words, if the full price sell-through and the depth of markdown don't change, then the markdown you will have to spend to liquidate the stock will always rise in direct proportion to the buy value. In our example, the markdown as a percentage of the buy is 360 divided by 2,000, or 18%. But we don't need to know what the buy or cost of markdown is to calculate what the markdown as a percentage of the buy is. We can work it out using this formula. 1 minus the full price sell-through multiplied by the depth of markdown. So in our example, this is 1 minus 60% times 45%, which equals 18%. To prove that this works for all levels of buy, let's say it rises to 10,000. Of that 10,000, with a sell-through of 60%, we'd expect to achieve full price sales of 6,000, leaving stock of 4,000 the original selling value to mark down. The cost of markdown would be 4,000 multiplied by the depth of markdown of 45%, or £1,800. And the cost of markdown as a percentage of the buy would be £1,800 divided by £10,000, or 18%. Just as expected. Case proven. You can obviously use this formula to work out what the markdown as a percentage of the buy would be for different combinations of full price sell-through and depth of markdown. I've shown a couple of examples here. I've also shown what the cost of markdown value as a percentage of sales would be. That's a bit more complicated to calculate and I'm not going to go into it now, but needless to say, it's also dependent on the full price sell-through and depth of markdown. Get in touch if you're interested and we'll explain how to calculate it. As you can see, if the full price sell-through is static, then as you might expect, the cost of markdown as a percentage of buy decreases as the depth of markdown goes down. Likewise, if the depth of markdown is static, the cost of markdown percentage decreases only when the full price sell-through increases. The fact that you can only decrease the cost of markdown by increasing the full price sell-through, or by reducing the depth of markdown, has a big impact on how we plan our markdowns. Let's now look at how you do this. When you take a markdown, you're reducing the margin that each sale will deliver. The standard assumption, therefore, is that the lower the markdown, the more margin you're going to make. This is indeed true as far as simple maths is concerned, but as we now know, to reduce markdown, you need to increase the sell-through or reduce the depth of markdown. How easy is it to do this in real life, and what happens if you do plan a level of markdown that is based on the wrong assumptions? Let's say that the business achieved a markdown of 18% of buy value, but has decided that's too high and sets a target of 13.5%. More margin in the bank? From our markdown model, we can see that to achieve a 13.5% markdown, we need to increase the sell-through to 70% or reduce the depth of markdown to around 35%. Assuming that we hit our plan, for a buy of £2,000, this would mean a full price sale of £1,400, and markdown stock of £600, and a markdown value of £270. But if historically you have been achieving a sell-through of 60%, what has changed that's going to give you a 70% sell-through? And if you reduce the depth of markdown to 35%, will that be enough to clear the remaining stocks? What this means is that if the actual sell-through does follow history and is 60%, then full price sales will be lower than planned, the stock that needs to be marked down will be higher than planned, and the depth of markdown needed to clear it will go up. Net result, markdown is £90 above plan, and you've lost the same amount in margin. And you'll have missed your sales plans, all because you didn't plan enough markdown. The other side of this is that if you had set a markdown plan that was a bit higher than you realistically needed, then you're going to improve your chances of beating the sales and margin plans. It's really important, therefore, that you look at the underlying drivers of the markdown value to establish whether it really is possible to improve the full price sell-through or to decrease the depth of markdown, and to set the markdown plan accordingly. If you don't, then the consequences are hardly ever going to be pleasant. With markdowns covered, we'll now turn our attention to promotional discounts. Promotions take many forms: 20% off everything, buy one get one free, money off vouchers, free gifts and so on. But the key point of a promotion is that the customer gets a price or other benefit in return for purchasing the promoted product. The cost of this benefit is the promotional discount. This is usually a straightforward reduction in the price the customer pays for the goods, but could also be the cost of providing the free product or gift the customer receives. This discount reduces the margin delivered by each item sold in the promotion. The end result of a promotion, then, isn't any different to that you get from a markdown. You make less margin per unit sold. You obviously need to build promotional discounts into your financial plans, but remember that there are other non-promotional discounts, such as those given to staff, which also reduce potential margins. These are usually very difficult to control, but they do still need to be planned for. The big difference is, as we've already said, that unlike markdowns, promotions are discretionary. You don't have to have them, so why do we use them? Promotions are used because they can deliver some important commercial benefits, and they definitely have a place in the retailer's toolkit. When you hold a promotional event, though, you need to make sure that it satisfies at least one of the following objectives. It drives footfall into the stores or visits to a website. This is often the main objective of a promotion, since the idea is that although the customers who are attracted by the promotion may not end up buying any of the promoted products, they might buy other products that aren't included in the promotion, and will maybe become more inclined to visit your outlet again in the future. It increases the sales volume of the promoted products. And finally, it captures customers who might otherwise be willing or able to pay the non-discounted price. I'm going to ignore the permanent discount model operated by some retailers. Furniture is a good example here, where every product seems to be available at a reduced price for a very limited period. In my book, these aren't promotions at all, since the true price of the product is the promotional price, and the customer isn't therefore getting any promotional benefit. Would anyone really buy a sofa at the quoted headline price? You'll note that I didn't include increased cash sales or increased cash margins as one of the main objectives of a promotional event. The reason for this is that although a promotion should result in an increase in sales value, it's actually quite difficult to even maintain the cash margin, let alone to increase it. And that's because the promotion has to deliver at least a minimum set uplift in the units sold for this to happen, and this uplift is often higher than you might think. The minimum unit uplift is the percentage increase in sales volume that needs to be achieved in order to deliver the same cash margin that you would have delivered without the promotion. I'll give you a moment to take that in. Let's look at an example. Let's say that you can reasonably sell 100 units of a product retailing at £20 after VAT without a promotion. The cost price of the product is £8, and it's therefore delivering a cash margin of £12 or 60% per unit sold. In a normal week, the total cash margin for the product would be 20 times 12 or £1,200. You plan to offer a 30% promotional discount on this product. In other words, it's going to sell for £14 during the promotion. This means that the cash margin for each unit sold will fall to £6. For every unit you could have sold at the non-promoted price, therefore, you're going to need to sell 2 to get the same cash margin. In other words, if you want to maintain the overall cash margin for the product, you're going to have to double your unit sales. There's a quick way to calculate the minimum uplift for a given level of discount. All you need to know is the margin percentage that you would have achieved without the promotion. The formula you need is margin on sales percentage divided by margin on sales percent minus the discounts percent minus 1. So in our example, 60% divided by 60% minus 30% minus 1 is 60% divided by 30% equals 200% minus 1 equals 100%. I've shown here the minimum uplift you need for a 30% discount with different pre-discount margins. As you can see, the higher the margin is, the more chance that the promotion will increase the cash margins, or that at least you'll break even. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't run the promotion if you don't think this is achievable, but it does highlight the need to be aware of the risk that a promotion won't necessarily deliver more margin. It's also worth considering that once you've factored in the cost of running it, a promotion event might actually lose money in real terms, although this might be outweighed by the marketing benefits. Let's look at a couple of other things you may need to think about. Understanding the minimum uplift can help you to decide which products to promote and how much discount or other benefit to offer to get the minimum uplift. Likewise, if the planned event isn't likely to deliver the required uplift in sales, then you would need to think very carefully about why you're doing it, but at least you know what is likely to be the financial outcomes of the promotion and can plan for it. Remember also that the types of promotions that work will differ by product category or retail sector. With clothing, for instance, a straight discount or money off offer will tend to work better, whereas the buy one get one free works better with food. You would also want to consider that a promotion might not increase overall sales, but might only bring those sales forward. This may not be a problem, but again it needs to be factored into your plans. If you're regularly running promotions, you may be interested in the promotional planning add-in for our inventory module, which helps you to plan and optimize promotions using machine learning techniques. Check out the webinar demonstrating the module on our website. With the principles in place, it's now time to turn the theory into practice. I'll be demonstrating this using AGR's Merchandise Financial Planning module, which gives you all the tools you need to plan and manage markdowns and promotional discounts effectively. The process is quite straightforward. The starting point, as always, is to plan the sales we expect to achieve. We then plan the true markdown, i.e. the level that we think we are genuinely going to need to liquidate stocks at the end of their life cycle. Once we know the base margin that this will deliver, we can build in a buffer to allow for underperformance. And finally, we add in discounts. So sales planning. It all starts with sales, and as I've said many times, the sales plans must be as realistic and as achievable as possible, otherwise all else fails. They should be built on robust assumptions that take into account all of the available information and on a clear understanding of what factors are going to drive any growth. We covered sales planning in the last webinar, so please take a look at that if you want more detail. The next step is to plan the true markdown you're going to need to clear your stocks. This is the real decision-making part of the process and may require a bit of detailed data mining. Start by analysing previous performance to establish what the normal full price sell-through and depth of markdown are, and use the calculations we discussed earlier to determine what the theoretical level of markdown this would result in. Cross-check this against the markdown as a percentage of sales and buy value that you've actually been achieving, and assess if the markdowns have worked in liquidating stock effectively by looking at the balance of current and old stocks. This can help you to decide if your markdown spend is too high or too low. If you do want to reduce the markdown, then you'll need to decide how exactly you can increase full price sell-through or decrease the average depth of markdown. The big question to ask yourself here is, can I achieve the same full price sales by buying less of each product? But the answer to that's another webinar entirely. As a result of our analysis, we've decided that a sell-through of 65% and a depth of markdown of 45% are realistic. This gives us a markdown as a percentage of sales of 18.8%, which we've rounded up to 19. We now need to apply this to our plans. Before you do this, set the intake margin percent. Just so we're all clear, this is the margin percent you'll achieve if the product is sold at its original selling price. And although we've not really talked about it, it's the other key driver of the margin on sales. The higher it is, the better, but it still needs to be set at a level that's based on robust assumptions about the cost prices you're going to be able to negotiate. Now phase the total markdown value over the weeks of the clearance event. Sales of 500 and a markdown percentage of sales of 19% gives us a markdown value of 95, which I've planned on 2 hits. At this point, make sure that the promotional discounts have been set to 0. As you can see, this will deliver a margin on sales of 236 or 56.7% and an intake of 595. These are the base intake and margin values for the period before promotions, which we'll use to set our buffer. All things being equal, if your sales and margin plans are robust, then so is your margin plan. In other words, it's what you should be able to deliver. Note how the potential margin on sales is reduced as a result of the markdown, both in the week the markdown takes place and in future weeks. Having set the base plan, the trick now is to build in a buffer by reducing the sales plan and then increasing the margin plan by the same amount so that the buy value stays the same. You don't need to make a big change to the sales and markdown, just enough to give you a bit of leeway. Let's say that you drop the sales by 20 and increase the markdown by the same amount. This results in margin falling to 223.6 or 55.9%. Intake though hasn't changed. It also means that the markdown as a percentage of sales has risen to 24%, which, if we assume that the depth of markdown doesn't change, would mean that the sell-through would drop to between 55 and 60%. If you set the real markdown level that you need using robust assumptions, would you really expect this to happen? Making these adjustments, therefore, means that you're not buying any more stock, only setting a plan that you should be confident can be beaten. Don't forget to save a copy of the base plan for reference. In AGI you can do this using the Save to Version functionality. And if you do want to build in a bigger buffer, then the other thing to look at is intake margin. Reduce this by a percentage point below what you're certain you can achieve, and you're going to have yet more headroom in the margin. The final thing to do is to plan the promotional discounts. All scheduled promotional events will obviously need to be planned for, but even if you don't have any events scheduled, it's worth planning some discounts. It's another buffer against underperformance that you can utilise only if it's needed. Remember that discounts are discretionary, and every pound of discount that you plan but don't use is a pound added to the margin. For our example, I've planned in one 20% off promotional event that will run for 2 weeks. You can see that the discounts have a direct effect on margin, and note that the intake will also rise by the amount of the discount. Remember to consider the minimum unit uplift when planning the discount. I've not assumed any additional uplift in these workings, and to reflect any new events in the sales phasing. Remember also that the percentage discount for a category will be dependent on the number of products that are being discounted, and could be lower than the percentage offered. Once all of the discounts have been planned in, you can save the plans to use as a fixed benchmark against which you can measure actual performance. Finally, a few words on managing markdowns and promotions in season. As we said earlier, markdowns are not optional, and you must take them if you want to reduce stock to as low a level as possible before demand stagnates. In simple terms, spending less markdown than you've planned will only be possible if sales overperform. If sales underperform, don't make the mistake of trying to salvage margin by spending less markdown, because doing that will come back to bite you later in the form of excess old stock. If you've built in a buffer as we discussed, then it's more likely anyway that you'll be overperforming against the plan, and this shouldn't be a problem. Remember that you are allowed to spend the markdown that you've planned. Promotions, on the other hand, don't need to take place, so do try not to use all the discount you've budgeted for. If sales are lower than planned, you might be able to recoup some margin by not running any promotions. In this scenario though, the discount might help you to get rid of some of your excess stocks before the markdown is needed, and deciding what to do would require careful consideration. If you are overperforming, not using the planned discounts would increase margin straight away and should be a no-brainer. Finally, the margin on sales is primarily dependent on the intake margin. So if you are able to achieve an intake margin that's higher than as planned, you're definitely going to increase your margin. I hope this webinar has given you an insight into the dynamics of markdowns and discounts, and that you now appreciate that if you want to hit your margin plans, you should take the time to plan markdown and discounts well. In summary, this will not only ensure that your margin plans are realistic and achievable, but will also mean that you'll be able to avoid the unplanned attrition to margin that happens if your markdown plans are too low, and that you'll have built a buffer in case of underperformance. Of course, if you are looking for the right tools to deliver these benefits, then AGR's Merchandise Financial Planning module will provide you with everything that you need. To find out more about the module, or to book a demo, please contact us on info@agrdynamics.com. And don't forget to visit our website to sign up for our final webinar or to download the earlier ones. Before we go, a couple of questions came through while the webinar was running, and I think these would be of interest to the wider group, so I'm just going to respond to them now. The first one is the Merchandise Financial Planning solution compatible with any ERP system? The answer to that is yes, it is. AGR can pull data from any ERP system. We also have standard data connectors to the Microsoft ERP solutions, such as D365. The second question we had, how long does it typically take to implement the modules? Well, this can vary a lot between businesses, as you'd expect, and depends on the state of the data and on any customization requirements that the client has. But I'd say that you'd be looking at a minimum of 15 days. Finally, we've been asked if the system can be configured to support any way of working. Again, that's a yes. In principle, you can create as many different workspaces as you want, but we do recommend that you keep these to a manageable number. And that's it from me. Thank you for attending this webinar, and goodbye.